Hello everybody, happy Friday. We're gonna be doing some unit testing today. Fantastic. A little bit boring sometimes, but I think this one's gonna be pretty good. I actually haven't gotten a chance to test my Shiny testing library yet. So this will be a good opportunity to see if there's anything wrong with it. So it's ready for the wild. Is anybody here not doing unit testing? They've come just for the learning. I want to know if I've got the advanced crowd or if I've got people that are just starting out. In the meantime, I'm going to actually put on a couple NuGet packages that I also like to use. Not as much as I should be doing, which means none, right, Danny? That's what most people tell me when they say not as much. Usually means you've got a test or you've got a testing library. So I'm going to put in one called Fluent Assertions. This just kind of makes everything look fairly clean as you're doing your unit testing. Otherwise, you end up... I'll show the kind of the stupid way of doing it and then how Fluent kind of cleans that all up. So I figured if we have time today, I'll do a view model as well and probably throw that into the unit testing. But for now, we've got this big monster of complexity that started out last week. Oh, it's not even finished too. So I imagine this guy's going to fail some unit tests, which is fantastic. So what I want to do today is actually start to test out. Yeah, we'll test this guy too. This is my domain, business logic. We'll test that a little bit, but definitely this is the guy I'm after right now. So I'm going to show some mocks, how we can mock this. A lot of people want to do, actually Dan Siegel recently, he was asking me, well, you know, I'd like to, he uses dependency injection when he's doing unit testing. I'm actually as anti-DI as possible in my unit tests, because the unit is essentially whatever you're doing in this method. So the first one we're going to do is, may as well start with this guy, on a reading. Are we going to do something proper? So now that I've got fluent assertions, let's create. I like to generally line my tests up against the same structure as the other side. So for instance, this one's got services, so I'm going to create a services folder. And I'm just going to steal this file for now. That looks good. And let's call this event delegates tests. And use your beacon library to notify you when you are in the car, to start a trip, and notify you again when you leave the car. So the question is why not use my beacon library to notify when I'm in the car or when I'm not in the car? Because I'm lucky enough to have beacons. A lot of people won't be. But that is a good idea. It's something I can do in the future for sure. Okay, so let's get this guy going. So the first thing I usually like to do is figure out, okay, what is this thing gonna need? So our trip service is quite large. Our event delegate is also quite large. So since we're starting with this guy, we're gonna mock these things out. So let's get our trip service, our data service, and our app settings mocked. So let's create another new folder with our mocks. Now there's some great mocking libraries out there. MOQ, mock, I don't know, however you pronounce it. I do use that when I'm going to kind of do one-off mocks, but a lot of the services I tend to use get reused over and over and over and over and over again. So I will use mock if I need it. Just right now, I don't. So we're not going to use it. So actually, let's give this guy a different name so he doesn't clash with our other test settings when it comes in. We'll call it mock. And I don't know what I've got in this thing again, so let's bring over app settings. Really? What's going on here? Probably don't have my references. Ha! Who knew? And I'll bring in this guy. I'll bring in this. Yeah, let's just bring them all in. Now, good practice is you're supposed to have a testing library per. So I should have a test services, a test biz tracker. What's going on? Ah. Okay, I thought VS was going to crash on me. It didn't. So it's normally a good practice to have separate tests for each different library. It's not a bad practice to be in. Obviously, for the sake of this, it's just me. Maybe the occasional PR. So I'm not too worried about it. Let's wait and see why this isn't figuring its stuff out. Ah, Visual Studio. Why aren't you figuring this out? It is there. You are indeed. Let's see if it's referenced. You are referenced. So, worst case scenario is I'll just bring it along for the ride. Oh, there we go. Now it's figured it out. Thank you. Now, every time I seem to demo with Visual Studio for Mac, it tends to kick me in the face somehow. Yeah, I'm not a big fan all the time. But they are coming with multi-targeting soon, for anybody who knows about multi-targeting. I'm pretty excited for that, because it'll make my life for doing open source quite a bit easier. They did release it, but it's not really working yet. Okay, so there we go. So there's our mock settings. Doesn't do much. Usually not going to. We're going to mock out. What else did I have in that guy? So event delegates, I had a data service. Yeah, why not? We'll mock that too. Mock data service. And we'll bring this guy in. I still haven't implemented anything in this library yet. My actual real method has nothing in it. All right, so that looks good, other than it's going to toss some exceptions. We'll come back to that. And I guess the trip service mock. Trips, mock trip service. And trip service. Fantastic. Okay, so now that we've got these guys ready to blow up on us, we'll start to bring them in. And let's create. So again, we're testing. What are we testing here? This event delegates. So this is the one time you're going to see me actually call new something. In this case, I'm going to new this guy up. Raw. So let's actually call this what it is. Event delegates tests. And we'll call this delegates. Hopefully Visual Studio's figured this out. It has now, thank God. Now, some of the purists out there will say each test should be newing up its own stuff and doing one assertion and yada, 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 yada. I'm not such a big fan of that, because a lot of the times you got to wire up like a whole ton of services, especially like this guy is pretty small. It's only 3 services. But if we look at our trip service, he's got like 5 things, probably a 6th coming in soon. So I'm not really, I've always found this to work. If I create my delegates at the top and then just run whatever method I intend to run on read, so this isn't going to do much yet, but then I can do my assertion pretty easily, and my tests get labeled pretty quick, and they are pretty much going through the same thing. And we're going to call this, for lack of a better term right now, on reading, until I know the cases we're going to do. One thing is that a lot of the unit tests, you know, it starts them off, it templates them as void, but you can do a task. And we will do a task. I'm not sure why we just don't do everything as async. That seems to be Microsoft's way these days. And let's create all of our mocks. Mock trip service. And let's bring in my namespace. And we'll bring in, what else was it? I guess all of them. I'm bringing in all of them. Data mock. What did I call this? I didn't rename it. Mock app settings. So mock settings is kind of a funny one. You'll notice it's just a bunch of get sets. I'm going to show why I mock this after, because my app settings tend to be a type of view model. So the settings get bound without actually, so you'll never actually see the settings library, but I bind to it. So these actually turn out to be notifiable properties. In fact, do I have, I'll come back to it. Okay, so we got mock app settings. And now we'll start to new all this junk up. Now you'll notice I'm creating accessors for myself, because obviously I need to work with the mocks. I need to tell them how they're doing stuff. And I've actually got the raw implementation, because a lot of times what you'll put in your mock is like, for instance, let's go to our data service, because that's a good spot. So this has got like get trip pings, get saved regions, etc. So I may want to actually control what's in them. So we'll put saved region. We'll say let's call it regions. I don't need to get fancy. And we'll do iList. What else do we have? Trips. And we'll new that up. And I create these as wide open as I can. You know, if you've got a test where you're like, I don't want to do add or add range, I just want to set the trips. Go ahead, set the trips. Do your worst. And we'll put trip pings in there. Trip ping. Nope. Let's call that properly trip pings. And we'll new this guy up. I still got to find a better name for that object. It's horrible. Okay, so that looks all right. So now what I would normally do is you have to go through the, if you're doing your own mocks like this, you have to go through the process of making sure you wire up all of your methods that you're intending to use for your tests, which kind of sucks. Like I said, there are other libraries out there called mock, MOQ. I can link that after, and it's really good for helping you set up these one-time methods. But the fact is, like I said, I'm probably going to use these quite a bit. So let's do our, come on, IntelliSense. Where trip ID equals to the trip ID coming in. And the funny thing is that these are all async, but none of the code in here is going to be async. So we got to do some extra stuff. So we're doing task dot from result. Oh, this is going to be an IEnumerable, right? Yeah. Okay. No problem. You know what? I'll come back and do this. I'll figure out what we need first. I don't actually end up having to do the full implementation. I only have to really implement what I'm going to need for this test, which I think is going to be quite a few of them, but okay. And we need our app settings. Beautiful. And now, last but not least, our delegates. So let's pass in our trips mock, our data mock, and app settings. Wicked. Okay. Not sure what. Go away, Visual Studio. There we go. Okay, so now we're pretty hardwired, set to do some tests with our event delegates. And what we're going to do is we're going to identify all of our test cases as we go through these. So let me get rid of others. And I only want to look at event delegates for now. And then I'll go through these piece by piece. So the first one I want to do is if I'm not on a trip. So basically what you have to do is you have to identify your inputs. In this case, it's the GPS reading. And we have to identify our outputs, which in this case is going to be the data service save. So it's saving a ping. And in this, I'm going to need a current trip ID. And I'm going to have to determine what I'm passing for my lat and long. No problem. Okay. So let's start with the easiest. If the current trip ID is null, there shouldn't be a ping. Why GPS would be on, I don't know, but you never know. Other bugs can occur. So we're going to go ahead and await this guy. And I don't even have to pass anything right now. No trip ping. So I have to implement save in my data service. Where is it? Which one do I want? Is it ping? It's a ping. Yes, it's a ping. So we're going to add this to our trip. Oh, no, it's a ping. So let's add this to our trip pings. And yeah, of course it's saved. Okay. I'm not even going to bother giving it a value yet. So we should see that our data current trip pings should have so this is where this library I like to use called Fluent Assertions comes in. Should be, actually let's make this even a little bit cleaner. Just say count should be 0. There shouldn't be anything in this array because I haven't set the trip ID. Beautiful. No. So I don't really have a good naming convention for saving these. I usually just do the method I'm testing, and then in this case we'll do no value or no current trip. So these methods can tend to get quite large in the naming, but it is what it is. You know, you certainly know when you get big things like this, like what the problem is. I will show some cases where we send through like multiple values, because obviously this method does a few more if statements than that. But so let's see. I'm also not a big fan. This is the most bland unit testing window I've ever seen. Hasn't even picked up our tests yet. Ugh. Let's see if this builds and it discovers some tests, or if I've got to fix some junk. So it's pretty quiet out there. Anybody working on anything cool this week? While we wait for Visual Studio to do its thing. Built. There's our test. And let's run it and see what happens. Green is good. So that went well. I almost feel like we should run a test that fails. You know, I like to do something as stupid as this just to make sure that everything works in the end. In this case, we're right there, so it doesn't really matter, but I just want to show what it looks like in a failure mode. There we go, I think. Well, blew up down here. It's still kind of green up here. Where did it go? Test results. Not really sure why it doesn't put the red up there, but you know, whatever. So it does show, like, you can debug these. It shows what the stupid mistake I made was, etc. So it gets handy. You got to do a lot of lifting to get unit testing going, but it pays dividends later on. So let's do that. So let's start up our next test. Our next test is to get by this gatekeeper. So let's go ahead and create a new unit test. And we'll just make this async because everything is async these days. On reading has current trip. And we'll do... Now I'm expecting this guy to fail just because I'm going to give it null. So I'm expecting some sort of NRE to happen in there. But this time, what I'm going to end up doing is our app settings mock. I'm going to say our current trip is some random GUID. So let's see how that goes. Probably not well. And in some cases, it is good to kind of test with passing null to see, you know, if you've got a critical piece of code and you want to know that it's, maybe it shouldn't crash, it should be doing some sort of try-catch. Passing null and passing bad arguments isn't a bad thing to test. And come on. If you're doing this in Visual Studio for Windows, it's quite a bit better at detecting the tests. It's come a long way, their unit testing window. For those who are using ReSharper and like the speed loss, I used to be a former ReSharper user myself. Its unit testing window is fantastic. It's much better than the ones that are built in out of the gate. So let's see. Yes. And it exploded, which is kind of what I expected because I didn't really give it a GPS reading. Yeah, it's an NRE. It's exactly what we expected to happen. Now, one thing I kind of on the topic of Shiny, this is a background service. So this will fire probably when your app is in the background a lot of the time. One thing Shiny does is, because if this service implodes, kind of your whole app goes with it. So Shiny actually, before it runs any of your delegates, it kind of wraps this, logs the exception so that your app can continue to run. The reason for this is I've seen a lot of people do kind of some goofy things in these services. They may call like a back-end service. They may call an Azure function and say, you know, here's my ping. And for whatever reason, they don't have internet, or, you know, Azure is down, which has been known to happen on occasion. Your whole service, your whole app doesn't need to implode just because you didn't wrap a try-catch around your remote API call. So if, you know, you should wrap it if you are doing anything like a remote network connection. But worst case scenario is, you know, one send off to your remote API fails and then 4 are good. Shiny protects it, so at least the 4 keep going, or the 4 went through and the 1 didn't, but it'll keep going. Your app won't die with it. No, I don't want to do a survey right now. I also want to make sure I'm on presentation mode. Okay, so we now have a GUID. Let's make up some GPS service. Now this is where hopefully in my Shiny testing NuGet package, this guy, I'm hoping I actually put an implementation of that. Aha, I did. Fantastic. So this is actually takes an interface So this interface is implemented in the testing library. So I'm going to do, oh, I don't like looking at namespaces. Let's reduce that. All right, so let's just do 1 and 1 for now. And what else do I got? What else is this guy expecting? It's expecting position and a current trip ID. Ah, okay. That's it. Let's not give it more info than it needs. And now this time our trip pings should have a count of 1. So a lot of people when they're starting to build out these tests, I mean, it seems like pretty trivial stuff that we're doing, and it is. It does help debug some of the more complex cases. Like once I get to, like this guy's going to be a little bit fun down here, this on status change. But it is going to help you debug a little bit up front, but there's a bit of a penalty to pay when you first start doing unit testing. But it's not about what you're working on right now as much as it is what you're working on later. So for instance, let's say I add some stupid statement in here later, and I don't write a new unit test for it, or maybe trip service is doing something bizarre, you know, whatever the case may be. You want to catch those breaks, because as I change code, hopefully these tests keep working, but if they don't, at least we know, okay, well, I fixed one thing, or I added one thing and I broke 5 other things. So this feature's probably not ready to release. So whenever you start doing unit testing, you know, just do them. They will pay dividends down the road. We're using NCrunch at work for live unit testing. I do live unit testing on occasion. I find that it really kind of saps at your CPU. I don't think there's live unit testing in VS for Mac. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not sure. There is in VS for Windows, and like I said, it's like how much CPU you've got. Give it to me. So I try not to. I do it on a rare occasion. Obviously not while I'm live streaming, because the live stream software it's eating my CPU right now. All right, so we've got, that's pretty much covers it. I could test if this is null, but I really don't care. All it's got to do is save. Does it save? I could check kind of some other tests that I could check is say, let's say did save properly. Did save properly. That's a pretty terrible name, but you know, it gets the job done. So this time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, I'll do the same assertion. Again, this is kind of a purist. They don't like when you do multiple assertions in a test, but I say nonsense. So let's take our first, and so I've got our first object. I want to make sure that this ping indeed saved all of the proper ping things. So if my latitude, I sent in 1, so should be 1. Good. Let's actually teeter these a bit so that we can see that they are saving to the proper location. You know, you can make typos. People make typos. I make typos all the time, so it's good to check on that stuff. And what else do I care about? Let's say, no, that's too much. I was going to check the timestamp and the ID. I guess I could say the trip ID should be equal to the app settings current trip ID. Current, no, not the odometer. It's a nullable. Okay, that looks reasonably well. And crunch, eh? I'll have to take a look at that. I haven't, like I said, I don't usually do the live unit testing. Some of the enterprise apps that I work with have like thousands of tests. And they don't necessarily do a good job of figuring out what code they need to test, so they just keep sweeping. But it's something I would look into that. The should library is... this one is fluent assertions. There's other ones out there, shouldly, and it looks okay. If I wanted to do this pure, I'll just show really quick. The pure XUnit way of doing it is like, so should be is essentially equals. So, and then you have to give it, okay, what's expected, 1, and what's the actual, so I'd have to do this, or ping, dot, what am I testing here? GPS latitude, and then you actually have to give it like an error, etc. So it just makes things look a little bit cleaner in my opinion. That's why I do it. So let's run all 3 of these tests now and just make sure they all go. So one thing is, you'll notice there's a lot of kind of repeated code in here. We're gonna get to that. There's some cool ways of cleaning this all up. Did this run? What the hell is it doing? Test results. I want to see if it... Oh, okay, there we go. I'm not sure why this doesn't turn green up here. Why do I gotta look at this window? Why can't it just be green? Turn green. That's it. Green. Feel like this is a deficiency that they should fix. Is this green too? There. That'll help my OCD out. Basically, when I'm looking at my test window, this is probably the list of the unit tests versus the actual test results. I guess I should move this over here. It'd be nicer in this window. I take that back. It's not nicer in this window, but I'll leave it there for now. Or I won't. It looks terrible. Okay, that looks better. Now I can actually see my test results. Okay, so we've got 3 tests. We've pretty much tested the crap out of our tripping or our on reading. That's fantastic. I would consider this guy, this would be 100% code coverage, which I won't show code coverage this week because I have no idea how it works in VS for Mac. But we've pretty much hit every line of code in this method. So this method would have 100% code coverage, no crashes, no NREs, fantastic. So let's do the big beast because this one's going to be a lot tougher, I think. It's not even finished, so I expect that this one is going to have some problems. So let's do async task on status changed, and I'll figure out what the case is that we're fixing in a second. Okay. Lots of if statements here. So which one do I want to start with? Let's start with if there's no saved region. I don't expect it to do anything if there's no saved region. There should be no geofence again. We're testing BS use cases, but again, we're kind of testing the resiliency of our app. I should be turning off geofencing. I'm pretty sure I am in the trip service. So this logically shouldn't fire if there's no saved region, but what if this was firing and we hadn't done something proper? This would crash and this would take out our whole app. So testing that resiliency isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's a bit overcooked, but it's not a bad thing because I will do something stupid in the future, I'm sure. So I needed to implement Get saved region by some sort of ID. Okay, so let's make sure our mock trip service, sorry, our mock data service has a get saved region ID. So we'll do saved. What did I call that array? Of course I didn't call it the same thing. Why would I? Saved regions. And we'll do first or default. x.id equals to saved region ID. And we'll get that out. Region. And we'll return task from completed result. From result. Beautiful. Now, let's go back to this guy. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm not going to give it a region. I'm not going to save anything to our array. So the stuff in data, the saved regions, is getting blown away every time a unit test runs. The data in it's getting cleared because it's in memory. So there'll be nothing in here. So let's just do, let's run the delegate. There's nothing in it. It should just run raw. Oh, not on reading, on status changed. On status changed, and who cares? Let's even give it something stupid. And we'll give it a, I'm not even gonna give it a geofence region. Oh no, I gotta give it a geofence region, otherwise it's really gonna implode. So let's do, I've got to actually give it a GUID because it is going to try and parse a GUID. And I'm going to give it 1, 2 again. And we'll give it a radius of, from kilometers, 99. Beautiful. Okay, so we're giving it a stupid geofence region state. And we're giving it a stupid geofence region. I just have to give it a proper GUID. So I would normally not test for, am I giving it a proper GUID? Oh, you're not giving me a proper GUID, it's crashing. You pretty much have, our test, the stuff that we're testing is, we have to assume that this geofence library is working properly. Hopefully it is, because otherwise a lot of people will be swearing at me. So I wouldn't normally test, hey, is that library actually producing a proper GUID? It is. If it's not, then you can come swear at me. All right, so there is our call. Looks good. So we should see in our data saved. No, hang on. What was this guy going to do? If it has a saved region. So remember, we have to catch our inputs. So our inputs are our geofence state and our region. So there is an input. Now I want to make sure that there is no output. So I've pretty much got this trip service. Start trip, stop trip. Well, some tests can also be based on the premise that they don't crash. So let's start there. So, no saved region. Does not crash. Terrible name. There's another thing that VS for Mac or VS for Windows does, is it's able to say, hey, we'll run this test. I can just click on it right here. I can right click on it and it'll say, do you want to debug this test? Do you want to run it? And it's all right here. I don't have to go and find it in this big monstrous list. This list is going to eventually gets pretty huge. It's hard to find your tests. So being able to just right click in the column or say run now is quite helpful. They need that. I need to open a feature request. So let's make sure this guy doesn't crash. It doesn't crash. Beautiful. Hard unit test. Okay, so the next one is, now I want to find a saved region. So let's create another test. This is horrible that I'm copying and pasting code, but you got to walk before you can run. Okay, so this time we're going to have a saved region. And what do I want to test here? Let's just... Ooh, there's a good one. Now we're getting into the cases where we actually... This is where unit testing is really going to start to help us out. And I think this is where I'm going to start to break up how... So right now we've been looking at what's called facts. It's these guys. It's basically running one test. One test does it all. Now what I want to get into is something called a theory. So a theory is, it's basically going to run the same method over and over and over again, but with different arguments. So I'm actually able to say inline data. And let's figure out what I'm going to pass to this guy first. I'm going to guess a geofence state. So I'm going to pass a geofence state. We'll just call it state for now. And then my first argument is going to be entered. So it's basically going to run this test 3 times, just with different state. So now I'm going to change this up ever so slightly. I am going to add to these arguments, but for now, let's start here. And I actually want to see what VS for Mac does. Does it actually show me 3 individual tests, or does it just show me 1? Doesn't like my naming. So you'll offer to help me fix the name of my method, but you won't give me a little bubble that I can press to run things. Okay, so this is all right. VS for Windows kind of breaks this into another little tree, and then it shows the arguments, but this is all right. I can live with this. So I'm going to assume that some of these are going to just implode. Oh, they didn't implode. Oh, I know why they didn't, because the test cases aren't going. Exited, and perfect. Okay, so right now we're getting to here, but we don't have a current trip, so that case is failing. This is in time is always returning true. We're gonna actually make that fail later on, but let's start with, what do I want to do for the current trip ID? So the next argument I want to do is nullable GUID. And this is going to be our current trip ID. Yes. So now this is where things start to get a little bit funky, because your test cases, you have to be careful with theories too, because what you're testing can get quite large. So for instance, I'm going to start with this. I'm going to give it all nulls. So this is essentially the test case we were running before. And this time I'm going to say our app settings is, current trip ID is going to be equal to whatever I tell it. Good. So we're still not doing anything because I'm essentially running the same tests as before. But now what I got to do is make this guy return something, because I actually want it to run. Or I could just test this case. Start a trip and stop a trip. So my output now is going to be this trip service. Does a trip start or does it stop? Or start, stop. So let's go back into our mock here. And let's do... I'm going to start with something simple. I'm probably going to need something a little bit more complicated later, besides a Boolean. But for now, this will do. So is trip started? Is trip started is true. Return task, completed task. And this guy too. Is trip started should be false. Now the reason I say this probably isn't going to be good enough because because false, it's going to be false if it doesn't get here, but I actually want to see that it stopped the trip. So let's do that. I'm gonna actually call this did trip start and did trip stop. So was the actual method called? Bool did trip stop. Because the flag would always be, if I was going to use the is trip started, true or false, in a lot of cases it would be false because it never hit that condition. But I want to actually see, did you hit that condition? Trip stop. And their default values are going to be false. So this is a case, again, if you want to look up MOQ, this is a case where I'd probably use MOQ because I can actually mock what this method is inside of my unit test and show that it was called. But I'm not going to do that today because that, if you haven't done a lot of unit testing, mock will blow your mind. So on status changed, if we give it a current trip ID, I'm going to assume this is time and range is fine for now. I've got to add a saved region. Let me give it a saved region. So this is did start and stop trip. And I'm going to give it a saved region that it can chew on. Data, saved regions, add saved region. I actually have to give this a good ID that I can feed through. Saved region ID. Saved region ID. And that's actually going to be the name of our geofence region. So it'll be saved region ID. So just to show you why that is. So what I'm doing is this geofence region has an identifier or a name. It's a string. I can give it basically whatever I want to give it. But in this case, I'm using in the actual, where's my actual service, my trip service. My trip service right here. So when it comes in to create a saved region ID, I'm saying if you're empty, I'm going to save it for you because I'm lazy. I probably won't set the ID. Then what I'm doing is I'm piggybacking the geofence region ID with the saved region ID. So basically when I look at the delegate, that's what I'm using. So I'm parsing the identifier. So if we go back to what I was talking about earlier about kind of app resiliency, this is a bit risky, I guess you could say. It's not, I'm assuming that all geofence regions are going to be that identifier. Now this is my app, right? So when I start doing integration testing and manual testing, hopefully we're going to run this case and it's going to fail if I do something stupid, right? So for now, I know the only places that I'm creating regions because I've kind of hidden them all behind this nice trip service. In fact, the app as a whole really won't even know to a degree that the geofences are even there, which that's pretty badass because I can create, like, who was it that was suggesting? Scarlet Code was suggesting I do beacons earlier. That's actually not a bad idea. Might be a little hard to set up. Definitely you'd have to be more of a technical user. But I could hide a lot of this stuff kind of way down behind stuff so that you don't necessarily, I could add beacons as I'm ready. Okay, so that's basically what happens. I'm just piggybacking the IDs. So let's go back to our regions. So basically what's happening right now is I'm going to give it a saved region. Where is my tests? No, I got to create on this. What else does this thing want? I've got the GPS latitude and longitude on there. I'm not even really looking at it. You know what? Let's just give it an ID and see what happens. Trial by fire. So, if I give it a null GUID, now comes the next part. And this is where this is where I said the purists will throw a fit about this, but expected did trip start. Bool expected did trip stop. Now the funny thing is that I probably should throw these into two separate unit tests, and I may still, but I just kind of want to show what goes on here. So let's do GUID, new GUID, and we'll do if it entered, let's say true and true. Let's say true and false. Yeah. GUIDs, man. GUIDs. It's because it wants a nullable, right? Oh, I don't want to pass this as a string. Sometimes to get around these things, you can just pass a string. So I'd make this a GUID. Actually, you know what? Let's make this easier. Why pass the GUID? Let's say bool create trip ID. Yeah, let's call it that. That looks good. And then what we'll do is if create trip ID, let's do it. Do it. Always a way around stuff. Yes, we've got too many. I think at this point I can pretty much everyone can agree I'm probably testing too much here. So let's do did start trip. Let's reduce this. Expected did trip start. And then I'll change this over in a minute. If it exited, I'm not expecting it to start. If it's unknown, I'm not expecting it to start. Good. Does anybody have any questions? Could be a lot to take in here. So I'm going to split these up into two separate unit tests just because this starts getting a bit wacko. What are some good docs or videos for someone who has never done unit testing? Well, I'd say this is a good place to start. This is a good video, maybe. Doc-wise, I'm not sure. Probably, I would Google XUnit. XUnit is a fantastic unit testing library. NUnit's like the oldest. You could look into NUnit. Certainly, they've been around the longest, so there's a lot of good stuff that they've done. You don't have to look into. I wouldn't look into mock. I know I've been talking about it a little bit, but I wouldn't look into that to start. Just because that one really throws people for a loop. All right, so let's see what this thing does now. Oh, I didn't actually do the expected. Okay. So my test is actually already flawed. Did trip start? I don't want to actually create a trip ID. And the reason is because that should be set if I'm expecting a trip to start. See, we're already reducing our tests. Okay, so for entered, I'm expecting a trip to start just because. If I'm exiting, I'm not expecting a trip to start. If it's unknown, I'm still not expecting a trip to start because we didn't. Oh, and that's the funny part. I've actually got this backwards. It should actually be the other way around. If I'm exiting the geofence, I'm expecting a trip to start. Ooh. See, this is why unit tests are good sometimes. It helps you think through the logic of what you're writing. I've already made several mistakes in this one. All right, so I'm giving it a geofence region. Saved region ID. So if I'm expecting the trip to start, then my current trip ID should not be null. I can also do this actually. Should be null, and then I think you can actually tell it. Let's do should be. Okay, I'm gonna do this properly. If expected, trip did start, should not be null. Else this dot app settings. Now I actually know this is gonna fail, and I'll show you why in a minute. Should be null. Okay, so entered, no trip, exited, trip, unknown, trip. Great. Okay, and we're going to run that. Hey, that one passed. Okay. That one failed. Which is kind of what we were expecting. And I'm actually got to test one other thing. So in the trip service, I added that trips did start trip should be true. Should be true. Now, as you start to get into multiple assertions, it's good to say it should be true because, so if we look at the first argument here, it should be true because the trip should have started. This method should have been called. Now let's do trip service dot. What did I call that method? You know what? Let's do this cleaner. It's a way better way to do this. Name of trip service dot start new trip. Here, beautiful. See, they made C# for dumbasses like me because I can never remember what I call stuff. So that's fantastic because now I don't need to remember what I called it. Because they've given me a method that just pulls out a string from an actual strongly typed variable. It's amazing I even can thrive in JavaScript these days. All right, so we've got that. And I know why it is failing, but let's run it. Let's run these again, because actually I'm expecting a bunch to fail now. You still passed. You still failed. Ah, there we go. So we pulled out another one. So it did call start trip for that, but it should have been false. Isn't that interesting? Okay, so we've actually, our tests did expose a problem. So that's fantastic. You know, depending on your delivery, you might have just saved yourself a few $1,000. Okay, now the question is, well, why? What stupid did I do? So one thing that our trip was doing is that we're kind of using this current trip ID in the app settings, which is probably a mistake because I've kind of split our logic off from two different places. And what I mean by that is I'm checking two services just for a current trip ID. So by doing this unit testing, I'm actually exposing a design flaw too. Which no, I didn't do this on purpose. This is my stupid. So what I've done is this current trip ID exists on app settings, and you know what? I'm going to take it off there. I'm going to put that where that belongs. I'm going to put that in here. Let's call this current trip ID. And we'll make it a getter, and it can be nullable. Beautiful. So I'm going to put that on here now. So this guy should throw a fit. Whenever, there we go. So we're going to make this, the internal trip ID is going to be private get set. I'm actually going to take this off of app settings now. So we're breaking code. That's all right. It's all in the name of design. Okay, good. Oop. Okay, so I don't need this here anymore. So I'm breaking lots of good code. Let's get rid of this. Oh, this guy needs it now. So I can almost get rid of these guys now. I'm still gonna keep them for now, but I could just use the trip ID as kind of my test base in here. So let's do, and we'll say when we started the trip, the current trip ID is going to be set. And down here, the current trip ID is null. Now, it doesn't matter how I'm loading this. We'll get to that later. I'm actually going to not make this a public setter because I want to force my testing habits to go through the method. So I could expose these, but I'm forcing myself to do things right. I'm not cheating the system, so to speak. So let's close others. All right, so there, now it's really ticked off at me. And the cool thing now, can I drop these now? Let's see. Let's go back to my event delegate service. Do I even need that app date anymore? I don't think I do. Oh, wicked. So I'm actually, by doing the proper design, this guy is deleted and deleted. And now things clean up quite a bit. Wicked. How's that? I think there's still going to be several pieces of code angry about this, but that's all right. We'll fix them. Okay, what doesn't it like? App settings, current trip ID. Okay. Ah, this is actually in the trip service. Beautiful. Oop, nope. So here's the other thing, because I'm exposing just the ID right now, long term I'm probably actually going to turn this into more of a trip object. Yeah. And the reason is because I'm going to be probably using other bits of data out of this thing long term. But for now, it kind of, it gets us through a patch. So I don't need app settings in this service anymore either. Okay. So let's go back to, yeah, now everything's ticked off now. Okay, so trips. Ha! Up here I was cheating. All right, just for the sake of the test. Why not? Up here I was actually setting the current trip ID on the app settings. So I broke all my tests by doing that. But we made, in my opinion, a pretty damn good change. We've reduced our code footprint. So that's always beneficial. Let's make sure most of these guys are passing, except for the ones that we know should be failing. Nope, still 3 more things to fix. Oh, current estimated odometer. Trip reminder minutes. Yeah. Okay, I don't need this right now. I do want that trip reminder minutes though. Even current odometer, for the purpose of this app, I'm thinking of making multi-vehicle. Just because some people have fleets of vehicles, so the fact that I've put this here is... This one can stay here though. Trip reminder minutes. How long a trip is going for. That one can stay. I think I'm going to get rid of the current trip odometer too. But I do need to get app settings back into here. I was too anxious to delete it. All right, so I think we're good now. Come on, VS. Oh, what's now? Okay. Ah, one more. So now we're saying, okay, the current trip ID should be null, but it's on the trip service, etc. Okay. Hopefully we see this relatively... Oh, look, we got one test that passed. And one one that failed. But everything else passed. So by doing that, we've now improved our conditions. Now we just got to fix this one guy. So why did this guy fail? This guy, we expect the trip to start. So we gave it unknown. Oh, I know why. Because I did an else condition, which normally isn't a bad... Normally, I wouldn't fire this, but you wouldn't know that as a user. So let's do this properly. Geofence state of entered. Geofence state entered. And geofence state exited. So I'm 90% positive I don't throw, I don't shove unknown geofence states through here. That's a fallback state for when the GPS isn't available. So when you're checking the values on an existing geofence. But it did expose my lazy ways in the unit test. So that's all right. Why do you think this code's never going to be... Oh. New status. Okay, now we're good. So I think all of our tests are going to pass now. Yay! So there, now all of our test cases for did trip start are passing. Now there is quite a few other tests that I still need to write for this, but I think I'm actually going to do a view model test. I think that'll be important to a lot of people. One thing I do want to show though, this is kind of a cool thing with Shiny. So this service will be registered with Shiny obviously because I'm using it in Shiny services. But Shiny has what's called state restored services. So this is outside of unit testing a little bit. Bear with me. So I want to actually make this notify property changed. And we'll call this is in the Shiny namespace. So I actually want to turn this trip ID into it's not ideal, but by turning this variable into a public get set, which I'm not going to do right now. Actually, you know what? Let's just do it. This dot set ref. Oh, I got to give this a GUID current trip ID. Value. So this is just a normal view model thing. Hopefully you've seen most of this stuff before. Okay. So by turning this into a view model property and marking my service as a notify property changeable service, next time this actually boots up and Shiny registers the service, is actually automatically going to bind to the current trip ID. So it'll restore this variable, which that's pretty cool because normally you'd have to bring in a separate service vis-a-vis these app settings. You'd have to store it in settings, etc., and figure out where basically you end up with all this code. But Shiny will actually do all this for you. So it'll put this variable back for you. So if this was set, you restart the service, you restart your app, it'll put this back for you. If you nullify it, obviously it'll remove it, so it won't. It'll restore nothing next time. So that's pretty cool. That saves me a lot of time. I know when I do these things. Dan Siegel from Prism was kind of nagging at me for this. He's like, "Why can't it remember the last GPS?" Well, dude, because those GPS services tend to die on you frequently. So this was actually, because he kept pestering me about this, I ended up adding something that did it. So that's cool. Try it out. There's a blog post on it on my blog, which is somewhere on the main screen, which I'll share after. Actually, my bot is supposed to share my links, but it never does. So let's do that. All right, so let's do, I'm just trying to think if there's a simple view model I can do. Let's create, what do I need to start a trip? Let's just create something super simple for now. We'll call it a trip view model. And we're going to do reactive object. This is nowhere near complete, but it's going to get us through a pinch. So I've got my trip view model. What do I need to create a trip? Well, I guess I'm going to need a vehicle ID in the future. And yeah, all my videos now are going to YouTube as long as the actual thing doesn't crash on me. So thanks for coming, Harrison. So we need a vehicle ID. We probably need a current odometer. I'll force that to be set. Yeah. Maybe this one's not a good idea. Yeah, let's do it for now. I'll change this after. This is more for the test. And we'll give a command. Start trip. So this is in no way going to reflect the finished model. It's just I wanted to kind of quickly show how we can do testing on this stuff. So let's do reactive command dot create from task. And I will likely be injecting a trip service, but for now I'm just gonna treat this as pretty dumb. So you can only start a service, or you can only start a trip when my vehicle ID, so I want to watch the vehicle ID, and I want to watch the current odometer. What do I call it? Current odometer. Great job, Visual Studio. I know this works. So we'll take in the vehicle ID and the odo. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, the vehicle ID cannot be null. So get value cannot be null. And the odometer can't be null. And whatever the start trip does, who cares for now? We'll come back to that in the future. So let's create our trip view model service. Trip view model tests. I would normally never put this in the root of my app either. This would go under a directory, but for now, that's great. So for this test, I'm going to create a theory, because this time I know what we're testing. So we're going to do, this one can be void. Start trip command tests. And we're going to give this some inline data. So the test cases I want to do here are just variants of vehicle ID, odometer, etc. And if I can start the trip. So we'll say what the heck? Okay. Let's do bool assign odo and bool assign vehicle. So if those are true, then I'll actually give them a value. Expected result. So we're going to new up our view model. Trip view model. And what we're expecting is start trip can execute. And this takes this will return should be, come on, IntelliSense. Should be our expected result. So what I'm saying is this command should not be enabled if my vehicle is null or my odometer is null. And this is probably going to grow over time. So this is a test where I would go pretty much all in, because I imagine that variable, I'm going to add probably a bunch of things to it in the near future. So if assign odometer, I'm going to say view model odometer, let's just say 1. That's easy. If assign vehicle is true, and we're going to do vehicle ID equals to some random good, and we expect that the would be whatever the expected result is. So our inline, let's start with our test cases. So false, false, false. If I don't give it one of these two, I'm expecting false. One side is true, I'm still expecting it not to pass. And last, everything is true, everything should be good. So this is basically just a truth table. Unless these two are true, this one can't be true either. So let's go ahead and run that. Let's compile it and see what we get. So this is really cool for testing your view models. If you do anything reactive, like I changed this drop down and then this drop down became active, you can do all kinds of those tests here. Testing view models is, in my opinion, and this is the part I enjoy testing, because you can see all the reactions happening. You can see if your commands are becoming enabled, disabled, if validation messages are getting saved. It's pretty cool. So did it discover? Oh, there, we discovered our tests. So there we've got our 4 test cases. Ah, and they're all green. Look at that. So that's kind of a simple, easy test to do for your view models, for commands especially. Good way to test your validations. That's probably a good majority of how you will test your view models, is just going through those cases. If I set odometer, maybe I expect the vehicle had to be set, or if I change the vehicle ID, maybe the odometer should be reset to a different odometer. Those are kind of some of the things you can start to think of. But for your basic test, I mean, that's kind of a cool way of just showing the command working and things changing the way that they should be reactively. So on that note, I've tested most of our... Oh, this is in green. Why didn't this go green? I thought this went green. Ah, good. So we're all green. We're finishing the live stream off with all green. So that's a good start. So if anybody has any questions, go ahead and ask them. I'll keep the stream going for another 30 seconds or so while I figure out who we're going to raid. Usually James is coming on by now. I wanted to raid him. Maybe he comes on at 5. Does anybody know? Maybe we can do one more test. I like dropping bombs on James. Unless he's in the chat. He's not in the chat. Jeez. Maybe what I'll do is I'll do some of the shiny wiring really quick. And if he doesn't start his stream by 5, then we'll part ways. Okay. So this was something we started last week. I didn't actually end up wiring anything other than the Shiny stuff. So Shiny has this requirement for a startup service. And in that startup service, you have to put pretty much everything that Shiny intends to use. So we have to bring in our trip service we have, and we'll bring in the trip service implementation. Not sure why this guy isn't showing up automatically. I know why. Okay. Namespace issues. Okay. These guys all, figures. Okay, so we've got our white. Ha! I called this biz trip tricker. There we go. Now it's happy. Okay. And what else do we need? We need that event delegates is registered, trip service. We don't have a data service yet. You know what? I'm going to probably use SQLite for now. I'm comfortable with SQLite. Net-PCL. I'm hoping that that's adding the NuGet package. Cool. So I'm going to show a couple things. This is kind of leading for unit testing for next week. I wanted to kind of show how I'm able to isolate my my SQLite essentially. So let's call this biz trip tracker SQLite connection. And in here, I'm going to inherit the SQLite PCL. No, wrong one. SQLite. And I want the SQLite async connection. There we go. So this guy's going to complain, obviously, that that's not set. Oop. No namespaces. So this guy's going to be looking for a path, a base path. So I want to show one cool thing first of all. Shiny actually puts in all these things that you're used to from Xamarin Essentials, like a file system service. So I can just inject this guy and say path.combine. And we'll do file system dot app data, which is where you got to store your stuff. So the full path to our app data, and then we'll say biz tracker.db. So if you've done anything with SQLite, I've seen a lot of people where they end up creating their own abstraction just for this database path. Do this with Essentials or do this with Shiny. You don't need to go through that hassle. Make your life easy. Now, I am going to leave this public, but for sake of testing and sake of your app, a lot of the times I don't want to give people access to this. So I may privatize or internalize this. But SQLite's actually remarkably good for unit testing because it'll create the database for you. You don't need any externals. You can wire everything up right there. So I'll leave it for now. But I'm going to show how we register a module because this guy's actually going to have the SQL. Here, where am I? This guy, SQLite data service. So this is going to be the implementation of our data service, which I'm sure as hell not doing today. So that's all wired up, but I'm going to actually inject our SQLite, or what do I call it? BTT SQLite connection. I'm going to show you how we wire this all together in 1 second. So what I've done by doing this essentially is I've created kind of a bunch of dependencies that have to go in. But let's say I'm the guy, so I'm the team implementing SQLite. So everybody else hates SQLite. They don't want to see SQLite. That's fine. They don't even want to register it. So I'm going to create, they don't want to know what dependencies to create. So I'm going to create what's called a module. If you've done any work with Prism or AutoFac, you're probably familiar with what a module is. So this is a way of me kind of controlling all of the dependencies I'm going to need within my library. Because again, my team told me if I'm going to do SQLite, I don't want to see it. You go away, Alan. I don't want to see your crap. I don't want to work with SQLite. So I'm going to add the BTT SQLite connection because I need that to be injected into my SQLite data service. And I need, obviously, the data service itself. SQLite data service. And now, when I register this over with in our global module, so you still have to wire it up. Sorry, guys, but we have to do that. Now I'm going to say services, register module, and we're going to call this the data module. And I'm going to merge that. Very clean way of registering it. So probably what would happen is, you know, if this was an enterprise team, they'd be like, Alan, you're forbidden from touching this file, or this is in a different repo, and my data service is coming across as a NuGet package. The only instruction I would have to give them is register this data module in your Shiny startup, and that's it. And I'll worry about my own dependencies. So what else this does is, let's say I wanted, because this is SQL back here, maybe I have an API that's exclusively registered with, like, say Azure Functions or something. Again, the external doesn't have to know about it because I've given them async methods. So they may not know that it's coming from SQLite or LiteDB or Azure Functions. But what I could do here is do this as twofold. I could have a SQLite obviously feeding the local data, but I could also even register a job back here. Again, without bugging the guys at the front end saying, hey, can you guys register a job for me as well to run? I don't need to. I can register my job, my sync job right here and say, okay, well, you need to have internet access. Let's say any, why not? And I can actually create a sync job. So this is basically what I'm doing right now is I'm registering my own sync job to sync data to and from my Azure Functions to my SQLite database. And I'm able to unit test this myself. So we'll give this the type of sync job. And we'll give it a name or an identifier. Name of sync job. So I love this. I love this because now I can do all these things without bugging anybody else. This will wire itself into Shiny. So I'll have access to running something periodically where I can send data back and forth. I could even do something like send notifications from here. So say a new, I don't know, your car blew up. You're not at it. Your car blew up. I could send a notification from this job as well, because I get access to obviously all of the services that I need that are registered with Shiny. But again, without my team even knowing I'm doing this. I could even register like an infinite loop back here just to screw with them, which I've been known to do. But we'll leave that out for today. So any questions? Anybody? That last bit might have blown some minds, but ask away if you've got questions. I'm going to be committing all this momentarily, so don't worry, the code's always going to be there. All right, well, happy Friday, everybody. Have a great weekend. Summer's almost over. Get out there, have some fun. I know in Canada it gets bitter cold, and I'm quite bitter about that. If you're coming from a warm climate, don't tell me, because I'm bitter. But have a good Friday, anybody's. I need to get one of those boxes like James has that I can just go. Thanks for watching.